Hello, beautiful light-filled souls. I am so excited to be here with Gregg Unterberger, and we're going to talk about some of the ideas in his book, The Quickening. We're also going to discuss, I had a session with him, and so I'm really excited to talk about this as well. But Gregg has several workshops coming up, and one is listening to inner voice and developing spiritual sight. That's is that Georgetown or Round Rock?
That'll be in Georgetown.
Georgetown. And then there's another one in Round Rock, and I'm going to provide all the details below. And then a third workshop. Also, please check out the show notes because I have the second annual Near-Death Experience Summit coming up with many, many speakers and researchers. Raymond Moody, Dr. Jeffrey Long, some of the top voices in NDE research will be talking with me at that summit, and then you get the chance to talk with them on June 23rd in the live summit event. But thank you so much, Gregg, for being here with me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and today I was thinking about trauma release and how many people have come to me talking about traumatic events. And I would like to begin with just asking you, what is the difference between spiritual activation and brain spotting and what we know works a lot of the time, which is rapid eye release or EMDR?
Yes. Well, let me start by saying what spiritual activation is, because that may be a new term. It is a particular modality that I've developed that allows someone to go to their most powerful spiritual experience and then relive that experience, recatalyze it, and even it has the potential to deepen the original experience. So imagine, for your listeners or those that are watching, imagine you could remember your most incredible spiritual experience and a fabulous meditation you had, a psychedelic experience you had, ayahuasca, a moment of spiritual awakening, and you could relive that experience in its entirety and even potentially deepen it. And that's the potential for spiritual activation, is to recatalyze the original state of consciousness and even deepen it.
And there are so many people who look to near-death experiencers and want to have an experience like this. So they do take drugs or they do try to deepen meditation. And this seems like a healthier, kind of beautiful way to deepen a spiritual experience or to even have one. Can you even, if you haven't had a particularly deep spiritual experience, can you open up in a session like this?
It's possible. The technique works better if there's an original experience that you can point to. But we've all had moments of bliss or peace, and sometimes I can ask a client to focus on that moment and then to breathe into it. And then as we use the brain spotting technique to activate the original neural networks associated with the original experience, it's like playing a loop in the brain over and over and over again, and we just kind of keep strengthening it. Almost like a song that you listen to over and over on the radio until you know every line in the lyric. So it's very exciting. There are other techniques that I describe in the book, The Quickening, which allow ordinary people without years of meditative experience to have these transcendent spiritual experiences. The root of the book actually came from being a little boy when I was like 14. And, I grew up interested in meditation, and all the hippie types that say, little dude, you need to like meditate, and you can see angels and touch the face of God. And I'm like, oh yeah. And so I'm meditating and I'm meditating, and it's like, don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful discipline, but I didn't feel the earth move or anything, and I sure didn't see Jesus. But I always yearned for those kinds of powerful experiences that are life-changing, that mystics talk about. And so The Quickening, the whole book looks at different ways, including spiritual activation, that everyday folks without and being anywhere near death can have those kinds of powerful transformative experiences. We can actually go knocking on heaven's door.
Yeah, in fact, there's a line, of course, that cracks me up in the book when it's in your chapter 8, Spiritual Activation, Hardwiring Your Brain to God. When the client says, I know you're not going to believe me, she said casually, though she were about to dish out on her favorite movie star, but all the rainbow colors have stopped whooshing from your stick, and Jesus just stepped out the end of the portal. So just amazing. So love that.
Yeah, this was a school teacher who I was working with, and she catalyzed, and she literally, we use an extendable antenna or wand, if you will, to do brain spotting to find an eye position in the client's field of vision that then triggers a neural network associated with his spiritual experience. Where we look affects how we feel, according to Dr. David Grand, who pioneered the brain spotting technique. And spiritual activation is an extension of that. So I actually use kind of I jokingly call it my magic wand, but it's like an antenna or a pointer. And as this woman was looking at it, the more she looked at it, she saw colors whoosh from it. And then eventually she said, and who knows how this works, it's probably in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, that Jesus stepped out. And she was struggling with some difficult decisions about what to do with her mother who had Alzheimer's disease and when to institutionalize her and when not to. And she got some advice, she said, from Jesus. I mean, who knows whether these experiences are real or imagined, but they're certainly emotionally impactful and potent for people.
And that's the important part, is the transformation, because a near-death experience totally transforms someone. So if people are being transformed in powerful and amazing ways through this modality, then why even worry, about the reality of it? Whether it's a regression, whether it's brain spotting, whether it's EMDR. But I would like to know, I guess, just for people who are very familiar with EMDR, what do you think is the major difference between brain spotting?
Well, EMDR, the original therapy goes back about 30 years now, I believe, and it uses eye movements to stimulate the right and left hemispheres of the brain to help process through trauma, to help digest trauma, so that people can go on with their lives. An example would be a Vietnam vet who comes back from wartime and goes to a fireworks show, and the fireworks go off, and it's like, oh my gosh. And his left brain goes crazy, left brain goes offline as he struggles to figure out why he's reacting so dramatically to this. And of course, he's probably seen bombs go off and mortar shells explode, and so that triggers a response in him that's automatic. So how do we extinguish that response? How do we get that to go away? And EMDR, which is widely used by the Veterans Administration, uses eye movements to fire the right and left hemispheres of the brain and break the link to the amygdala to reduce that fight or flight response. Brain spotting uses fixed eye positions in the client's field of vision. And we work with the client or the patient's visceral internal response to an eye position to tell when we're on the spot that is triggering the neural networks associated with the original memory. That's the technobabble response to your question, if you want to get that heady about it.
Yes.
The simpler version is, well, Tricia, when we worked together and I asked you to remember your NDE experience, and then I moved my finger in your field of vision, did you notice that it felt different looking in one direction than it did in another?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it doesn't make sense at first blush, but when you try the technique, you experience it for yourself, and there's a felt sense in the body. Someone might remember a near-death experience or a powerful meditation, and they feel a warmth around their heart. And if they look off to the left, maybe it's stronger than if they're looking to the right. And that likely means that we're firing the neural networks over and over associated with the original experience.
And do you think we condition ourselves to think a certain way, so certain patterns are just more hardwired in the brain, and this allows us to think differently? Because obviously I've talked about my near-death experience a lot, and been interviewed several times. And in that session, though, I picked up on something that was new for me. It was a feeling that was new, and that was profound. Even if that was all that I got from it, that added element was like a new way of thinking about the near-death experience. So I think that connection fascinated me.
Yeah, it's not like there's a lock or guarantee for my clients. Or that, by the way, in the book, there are complete instructions about how to do this at home. You will likely get better response working directly with a therapist trained in the technique, and right now that's me. But having said that, there is a home version of this with full instructions in the book, and you can try it for yourself, and it explains how to do it safely. Having said that, in the best of experiences, the individual will not only recatalyze the original state, but can sometimes go beyond it. There's a recording CD set that I put together called Exploring the Mysteries of Your Mind. People can Facebook me, and they can purchase a copy of it. And it includes a woman who had an experience where she was on a riding lawnmower outside of her house, and she heard this choir singing Amazing Grace. And she realized that there wasn't really a choir and that her mother was being welcomed over by people singing Amazing Grace. It was just a flash, and her mother was hundreds of miles away. She went inside, she told her husband, I think my mother's died. And then the phone rang, and it was her sister saying, your mother's passed. And so we started with that as the original experience, Tricia. We found the I position that correlated with triggering that experience and deepening in that experience. And she had a full-blown near-death experience with her eyes wide open, waking in front of 100 people in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Unity Church there. She saw beings of light. She was flooded with love, all the sort of classic NDE things that are on the scale. You know, she had nearly all of them, a point of light that expanded, incredible love, even seeing animals that she had grown up with who'd crossed.
Oh, that's very comforting.
With her eyes open. And boy, those are good days for me, because it's exciting to not only recatalyze the original experience, but take them into something deeper, or in your experience, have a deeper aspect of it.
Yeah. And to me, that was a profound realization, and it came at the right time, and it meant a lot to me. And I'll just tell people what I realized, but I went back to that love of God, because that's the most profound element of the near-death experience. And I've talked so many times, and near-death experiencers often talk about that love flowing in and how we're healed, and God is this, you know, we're just these receptors of all that love. But then I was able to see my soul and realize that for the first time I was safe to love. And that's been kind of a theme in my life and in my book and in this world, is there's a lot of crazy egos out there, and
yes,
sick people and really just messed up situations. And it is not always safe to love. And in the presence of God, it was completely safe to love. And that was so relieving. So to get that little added element and realize that this is the world I'm working in, and God is the safest person to love, that was very comforting at this time in my life.
Well, and for those of your folks in your audience that are familiar with the idea of shared near-death experiences, where someone in the presence of someone else passing or having a near-death experience get images or impressions of it. I hope I'm not saying too much, Tricia. Both of us were in tears for about 15 minutes of the session, because it was just the light and the energy that was in the room was so beautiful and so profound. So it was a real honor to be with you when you recatalyzed that state. And as far as I'm concerned, it just flooded the room. So.
Oh, beautiful. I'm so glad. That's wonderful.
And in the afterglow. Thank you.
Thank you for taking me there. It was very healing. And I would completely recommend it to other near-death experiencers, because we talk about our experiences a lot, after a certain amount of time, especially if we start writing about it. And to have an added new way of connecting with it or looking at it, to that piece is really essential. So I think it's vital to people who've had spiritually transformative experiences. And then I can imagine, have you worked with people who have had a shared death experience and went back to that moment with someone they cared about? I think I remember something about that.
Actually, I have not, but I think the technique certainly has the potential to help someone recatalyze that state.
Interesting.
And my friend Jack Morrison, one of my fellow therapists that I write about in the Quickening, he recatalyzed the state, but he understood it better in a different way. Like, oh, now I understand what it means and what it means for my life, which he didn't entirely or fully or in its depth grasp when he actually had it. That can be exciting. Sorry.
Was that the experience where he just immediately was healed of wanting drugs and alcohol?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Could you tell that story? Because that's fascinating. So he just woke up and felt relieved of wanting substances.
Yeah. I don't know that I want to be fair to Jack. I don't know that we're talking about addiction here, but he was, according to him, drank a lot and would smoke dope periodically. And he got up one morning and it was just one of those epiphany moments that seemingly comes out of nowhere, where it's like, it's a beautiful day, the grass is green, the trees are gorgeous, the sky is blue, and why do I need anything but this? And when Jack actually trained in brain spotting with me, and one of the things that they teach us in brain spotting is it's used for peak performance. So someone is on stage and they gave the best performance of their life, and they want to build that sense of confidence and lack of anxiety. They want to strengthen that in their psyche. And so you find the I position that correlates with them feeling even stronger and better about themselves. And so I talked to Jack in the middle of the training. I said, what if we did that with a spiritual experience? Like, what if we could like crank it up to 11? Wouldn't that be cool? And just sit on it and sit on it, sit on it, get those neural nets repeating themselves over and over until the person knew it by heart. And that's where I joke in the book, like, what if we could hardwire our brain to God? Now, that might be a little bit of an overstatement, but I'm not convinced that if we did it enough, that it'd be much more easy. It's almost like, once we get the phone line open and a good connection, we can live out of it a lot more. And most NDEers experience it that they're NDEs that way. So when Jack recatalyzed this experience, he understood what it meant and how it happened in a way that he hadn't before.
And what more did he understand? Because I found that part fascinating, the part that his deepening element.
Yeah, it felt like it lived in him more. And some of these things, as with most spiritual experience, it's ineffable. And as Eben Alexander would say, I don't have an alphabet for what happened to me. But to hear Jack talk, it was more deeply rooted in him. And that he understood that it was time for it to happen, and that he could carry the depth and width and strength of that experience with him forward in a way that he hadn't before. And
I do want you to share your experience with the technique too. So you, I believe I remember hearing or reading that one of your early experiences that you went back to was why you became a therapist, the spiritual moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a beautiful experience in a workshop where, very briefly, I had a visionary experience where there was a thunderstorm and all these seagulls were somehow killed in the wind and the tornado and the storm, and they were all dead in the beach. And I was not a therapist at the time. I was actually a nightclub disc jockey. And in my vision, I started picking up the seagulls and holding them in my hands, and light fell on the seagulls. And the seagulls came back to life and flew off. And I did that with seagull after seagull after seagull. And I came out of the whole thing, and I thought it was the most ridiculous thing in the world and presumptuous thing in the world. I'm in the nightclub business. I'm not in the seagull healing business, or I'm not any good to anybody. And the therapist, who turned out later to be my mentor, Dr. Frank Allen, said, well, what do you make of that? I said, I don't have a clue. And he said, look around the room. Well, everybody had been laying around doing a visualization exercise, and their arms were kind of up like this, and somebody was sitting on their elbow. And he said, what do you see? And I said, well, it looks like a bunch of broken seagulls. And Frank said, well, you better start picking them up, hadn't you? And I thought that was the most presumptuous thing anybody had ever told me. And I said, I don't have a clue how to be helpful. And he said, well, if you're waiting around to be perfect to help people, it's going to be a long wait. And that was the beginning of some intuitive and spiritual gifts that came on the heels of that experience. And then I made the decision to go back to school to become a therapist. So when one of the first things I did after my brain spotting training was to come back and target that experience using spiritual activation, and I got to relive it and deepen it. And it just felt like I grew about 500 feet tall, and my head was in the clouds and in the sunlight somewhere. And then I had roots going down to the very center of the earth. And it dawned on me that as I had that experience, that was what was meant by the expression to be in the world, but not of the world. If I may say so, we all know people that they're spiritual, but they're disconnected. They have a lot of trouble living in the world. And that includes a lot of NDE people. And that's not a judgment. How do you get your feet back on the ground after an experience like that? So I think, according to Dr. Jeffrey Long and PMH Atwater, it's like 3 to 7 years to integrate and start, like getting your feet on the ground. And then we all know people on the other end of the extreme, the stereotype of the CPA types, the banker types. And all they're interested is in the Cartesian world and making money and materialism. And so then how do we bring spirit or the divine down into the world to make it manifest and help awaken and heal the planet? And I would suggest that the balance between those two realms is how we do that.
Yes. And this sounds like a great way to add wonderful healing to the world. And I love that idea, actually, of hardwiring the brain to God, because every time I go deep with this idea of how do I tell people how to heal, how have I received the most healing, certainly I've tried so many different modalities, and the last couple of chapters of my book goes through all the modalities that I've tried, and rapid eye release was a big one for me. And however, when I do my own energy work and my own work, it is that power and that love of God that shifts things, that there is no power greater than that love. And that can move mountains in a sense. It also can move mountains of trauma, mountains of, fear, all kind of things from the body, and just transform it instantly. So if you're more hardwired to God, that idea of staying that way, then it could happen more quickly and easily for people, I believe. Have you seen that with clients who have really gone deep with this?
Yeah, Francine Shapiro is the woman that, the therapist that originally pioneered eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, that's used by the VA for trauma. And she says that a spiritual moment is actually a hallmark of EMDR treatment, that when it's working correctly, someone will have a flash of spirituality or being enveloped in peace. Now, depending on what their worldview is, they may or may not describe that as God or the divine. But I've had a lot of dyed-in-the-wool agnostic and atheists tell me in the middle of session, I just feel so incredibly peaceful. I feel like everything's going to be okay. And, and of course, more traditionally, we might explain that as the peace that passeth all understanding. But they say tomato and I don't say tomato. I just, well, wow, I'm glad you're feeling so peaceful, and my best guess is it's the presence of the divine or a certain level of spiritual awakening, but it's not my place to dictate that for them. But yeah, often people spontaneously have these experiences. One of my dear friends is an agnostic or an atheist, and she's had experiences. We did a little something off the books. My friend Kathy has had experiences of contact with people who've crossed over. And I said, does that change your worldview at all? Well, I still don't believe in God. I just think we go on in some way. It's like, okay, whatever.
At least she opened up a little.
Yeah. So, I think very often we see that. And I think in the best of all possible worlds, we have, instead of it just being therapy or just being spirituality, in the best of all possible worlds, clients that are spiritually awake find a therapist with a background that will allow them to bring that into the session without them feeling weird. So I have clients that say, Gregg, I like to work with you because I can talk about listening to an inner voice and you're not going to tell me to go see a psychiatrist and get on Thorazine, because you think I'm schizophrenic. Because let's face it, there's a big difference between an inner voice that says, go get an AK-47 and take out everybody at Luby's, and an inner voice that says, the light of God lives within you.
Yes. Or consider taking this road instead of this road, or, something quite simple. Or have you
guidance? Yes.
Yeah. Have you thought of contacting this person? The little whispers.
Oh, I love those. Those are great.
Yes. So I don't want to move on too quickly, and we'll probably come back to spiritual activation, but I want you to tell me more about breath work, and you're doing a workshop on this. I've tried that at times, and actually, I'm just being honest, been irritated with it. So it hasn't worked for me.
Yeah.
So tell me, and it was maybe they were too prescriptive of, you put your finger here and you're breathing, and then you're supposed to, and I was like, I can have my own experience. I don't need to do this. But breath is definitely connected to slowing down everything. And I do understand that through meditation. What is it that you teach through this?
Well, let me back up the bus a little bit. Some of your viewers may know of a psychiatrist, a Czech psychiatrist named Dr. Stanislav Grof, who did 30 years of research into hallucinogens in a controlled setting as a way to catalyze different states, what he called non-ordinary states of consciousness, what we might call mystical experiences. And he found that if it was used judiciously and in the appropriate setting, not just at a wild party, but if it was used appropriately, that it could be a tool for awakening and great psychological and spiritual healing. And in fact, we are rediscovering that ketamine is now being used again in controlled settings for major depression with great results now. But in the mid-70s, they pulled the plug on his research. And he said, there's got to be a way to catalyze these powerful states of consciousness without drugs. And partly by accident and partly by intuition, he developed what he called holotropic breathwork, which is a modality that uses breathing, powerful evocative music, symphonic scores, tribal drumming, sacred music from around the world, in a sacred and supportive set and setting that's very therapeutic to catalyze NDE-like experiences. It sounds crazy that we can get there without drugs, but it's very, very exciting. I studied with Dr. Groff and with Jacqueline Small, who also is the developer of integrative breathwork. And my own iteration is called transpersonal breathwork. And in these workshops, individuals will spend 3 hours breathing in a Kundalini style accelerated breathing, and you don't have to change nostrils or stand on your head and quack like a chicken while you do it. It's pretty straightforward. But they breathe that way for 3 hours. We play this incredibly intense music, and it's pretty loud, not deafening, but nightclub levels. And it's almost like the alkalinity of the body changes, and hallucinogens are alkaloids. So the blood becomes very alkaline, and it fires up parts of the brain associated with memory and emotion. And people have past life memories. They have visionary experiences where they meet people who've crossed over. People say, I met Jesus, or I touched the face of God. A couple of weeks ago, we had a woman who left her body twice, had 2 out-of-body experiences in that 3-hour period. All the kinds of things that are exciting and thrilling about mystical experiences that I always heard about as a kid, we can have those kinds of experiences without drugs and without having to meditate for 30 years either. Okay. If anything, most of my spiritual friends I come under fire for, well, that's cheating, or there is no free lunch, or you don't get to have it that way. And it's like, well, maybe you don't think we get to have it that way, but I've been doing this work for 20 years, and everything that you would see in a mystical experience or a drug trip, we've seen in breathwork.
Amazing. Well, that kind of reminds me of slogans like, people will tell you, oh, life is hard. Well, it doesn't have to be. Or people say things that they expect because of their past experiences for it to always continue that way. But we're evolving. And why can't these experiences evolve in a different way? Why can't we heal quicker? Why can't we have a deepening of spiritual experiences like this? Of course we can.
Yes. Well, and the American psychic Edgar Cayce said that as we moved into the 21st century, that there'd be a thinning of the veil. Okay, it's a nice way to put it. So regular people might have more access to spiritual planes. The work of Helen Schuckman, who's responsible for A Course in Miracles, said that her inner guide that she identified as Jesus said that we're in the midst of a celestial speed up. The time was kind of speeding up and things could happen in a quicker, faster fashion. So there is some precedent in spiritual literature that this is certainly possible. And just like there are faster and slower ways, to get from one place to another, if I'm walking from LA to New York, it'll take me a long time. If I drive, it's faster. If I fly, it's even faster. So they aren't shortcuts, but they are faster routes to get to the destination that we want to arrive at.
And I feel like you're the right person for me to ask this next question, because it might be a little bit silly, but maybe you can talk to one of my viewers who's a friend as well, who watches my videos. But she's beginning to date, and she's dating this guy who every weekend he's going and, to another ayahuasca event, or, she's like, how many hallucinogens is this guy doing? I mean, he really is serious about wanting a transformation, but it's a little disturbing to her to think of someone, taking drugs to that level. So what would you say to someone who is experimenting in that way and hoping, for a spiritual experience?
Well, I mean, ayahuasca has a time-honored tradition of being an effective way to alter consciousness. So I wouldn't argue that point. I don't want to valence this as better or worse. What I would say is for people that are a little gun shy about using drugs or having an ayahuasca experience, or they're not real keen on throwing up a lot before they have the experience, pretty much a prerequisite. There are other ways to get there, and you don't have to get sick, and you don't have to take any drugs, and you don't have to leave the country. Don't have to worry about the popo coming to get you. You don't have to worry about the source of the hallucinogen and whether it's clean or not. In breathwork and spiritual activation, we are unlocking chemicals in the brain that are already there. We're just doing them without drugs. So,
right.
But it's not my place to judge and say, well, that's better, or that's worse, or this is clean and that's dirtier. or whatever. I mean, there's certainly a time-honored tradition of people using hallucinogens, to unlock consciousness.
But consecutively and frequently, is that the best? Would you?
my caveat, and I say this in the last chapter of the book, I'm not alone in this, I'm citing Abraham Maslow, the famous psychologist, is, Alan Watts said, when you get the message, hang up the phone. We can't just live our lives constantly looking for the next spiritual high. What we can do is move towards those experiences, have them, and then integrate them. And Tricia, it's a perfect example of your experience. Like, oh, now that I know that I am love and that there's a place I can reside in my head where it's safer to love in the world, I can be more free and extend that love and offer that without endangering myself so much. And I have a new clarity about this. So those spiritual experiences are not just an escape from the mundane world, but we then take them and utilize them so that our lives are transformed and the lives of the people around us are transformed. And then that helps to awaken the planet, and that gives us a place to sort of rest in our mind. Like, I know this is to be true because I've experienced it. It's not just something I read in a scripture or quoted from a popular NDE experiencer. It's that I know it because I've been there and done that. And that's a really powerful way. Carl Jung famously said, I don't believe in God. I know God is real.
Yes, he's a knower, not a believer. So there's another part of the title of your workshop, which I'm kind of curious about, the kingdom within. So it's, the transformational breathwork experience. Why did you pick the kingdom within?
Oh, you're good. You must be a writer or something, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very intentional. It's a quote that we don't often think of. Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is, it's up in the heavens somewhere. Mother Teresa has the kingdom. No. The kingdom of heaven is within you. It's within you. It's within me. It's within everyone that's watching right now. It's not someplace else. So then how do we go inside and make contact with that? And there are lots of different forms: meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, martial arts. You can go into a state of flow in sports, out in nature and beauty, NDEs. There are lots and lots of doorways to that. But that choice was to remind us the kingdom of it is within us. It's not someplace out far away. We sort of have to unlock the blocks to get through the doorways inside of ourselves. But that's where heaven and God and the divine reside in my work.
I believe that, and I know this because deep internal shifts immediately transform the world. And the more you start doing them, the quicker the transformation is, which is...
I like the way you think, young lady.
Which is amazing. When you have those verifiable shifts in your outside world, I mean, that nothing gives me more joy. And I'm sure as a therapist, when you see that with people and with yourself, that gives you great joy too.
What's really wild sometimes is sometimes people will have a shift in a workshop. Quick story. I was co-leading a workshop with my mentor, Dr. Frank Allen, and there was a woman who had been in the workshop since the very beginning of the workshop. It was a week-long workshop, and we would go to dinner every night and talk about what we were working on. And this woman had this phenomenal shift, and she came to dinner, and the waiter who'd waited on us every single night, knew us all by name, looked at her and went, "You haven't been here all week, have you? Because you're new. Did you just arrive late?" Or, "I didn't think Dr. Allen let people come in late." "No, I'm Wanda." It's like, you're Wanda? It's like, no, you're joshing me because your face is completely different. Because we'd all seen the transformation literally in her face. But the idea that somebody objective, a waiter, had been waiting on us all week and he could see it, that was just mind-blowing. And so sometimes we call that, when somebody has a lets go of a lot of trauma from their past and they look absolutely radiant and it seems like the wrinkles disappear, we call it the breathwork facelift. You look so good, Madison.
Oh, you just got a lot of people in the Austin area to sign up just for that. And they're going to bring their boyfriends and guys who keep running off and doing drugs, trying to have more and more experiences. I like that. I like the way you think. But it's true. I didn't look like the same person after my near-death experience. And I wish we took more photos back then, because in the 90s we didn't.
Yeah.
But there was a dullness to my eyes before my experience, and there was so much light in my eyes, and I could see it. I could see in a photo that I had changed. And I've seen that in other people, near-death experiencers, have, you know, played around with that and showed their photos. It's truly phenomenal when that happens. That change. So the other thing that I'm just curious about is when you talk about the spiritual activation and getting us back to those really, really important spiritual moments. There was a story that you told in your book about Angela and the 50-foot angel. So if you want to talk about that story, or anyone who's talked about guides, this is a particular interest to me. So angels and guides, have you taken many people back who you can recount some of their experiences?
Yeah, well, the story's in the book in great detail, about an older woman heard me talk about spiritual activation, and she said, well, I came to see you because I wanted a spiritual activation because when I was a young woman, and this was like 40 years ago, she said, I was pregnant and I felt like the baby was coming and the doctor didn't believe me. And he said, okay. And he was checking to see if she was dilated or whatever, and put her feet in the stirrups as it were, and leaned down to check. And she said, and in that moment, I just exploded and blood went everywhere and I passed out. And she said, but it was the strangest thing, because just before I passed out, I saw the robe of what looked like to be the bottom of a luminous 50-foot angel. And she said, and then I passed out and I don't know what happened. And my son was born safely and everything, but I don't remember anything else about that. And she said, could we focus on that and reactivate that memory and see if there's more there for me? And I said, yeah, we certainly can, but I was a little reticent because there was a lot of trauma involved in it. And I thought we might start processing the trauma and working through the trauma. So we found an eye position, a relevant eye position that triggered that sense of connection with the experience. And I literally had a sense like, Greg, grab your notebook. And so while I'm holding the wand, I was scribbling notes. And so what is in the book is a transcription of what actually happened, not a recreation. As an author, you know, sometimes we have to recreate conversations to the best of our ability and the best of our memory, but it's pretty much word for word. And so this woman catalyzed a state with her eyes open where she floated up through the angel and saw all these beautiful different colored lights and orbs. And she thought maybe she's going to see the spirit of her son about ready to be being born, but she didn't. She wanted to see the face of the angel, but she didn't, but she felt loved. She said, I feel so loved. She said, this is home. This is where I belong. And saw these amazing colors and dipped in and out of different colored lights and different vibrations and states of consciousness. And none of that was in her original experience, or at least that she remembered. So I've often wondered whether she had a full-blown NDE and blocked it, or whether all she had was that and we took her deeper in the here and now. And for the skeptics in your audience, and they're allowed, maybe she imagined it all. But for her, she said, I absolutely know that I am spirit and that this is my home. My home is in heaven. And I'm visiting the planet. And a lot of NDEers are probably bobbing their heads out there. Visiting
and I am over here, yes.
Yeah, but this is my home. This is my true home, is heaven. And I have work to do while I'm down here, and I'm going to do it. But now I remember that I'm loved, and I'm absolutely certain that I didn't make that experience up, and it's meaning for me.
Interesting. And then I also want to talk about, beyond angels and guides, the ancestors that people often see, because that's a part of near-death experiences. And there's a huge desire for mediums and psychics, you know, to connect with people's ancestors. But the idea of doing it yourself, there seems to be a movement with many mediums. I think Suzanne Giesman, who runs Helping Parents Heal, runs a class of helping people with their own ability to connect in that way. And there are several mediums who do that, become your own medium in a sense. But how does this work? Just allow people to access this who may not have worked on their abilities in that sense? Well,
a lovely book that I'm sure you've heard of, and maybe some of your viewers have too, called Hello from Heaven.
Yes.
That's written by Bill and Judy Guggenheim. And yes, they're that Guggenheim, the Guggenheim family. And Bill and Judy estimate that some 40% of people spontaneously have had contact with people who've crossed over. And in fact, if you'll talk to your friends, I hear this in my office all the time, people will lean forward and go, Gregg, you're going to think I'm nuts here, but I saw my father and he died 10 years ago, you know. And what you'll find is lots and lots of people have had some form of spirit contact, some very casual, like a sense of them being in the room. And some, I talked to a policeman who, you know, walked downstairs and saw full complete 3D manifestation of a friend of his who passed, smoking a cigarette and talking to him. And he swears he came down in the middle of the night and saw the guy in 3D, went upstairs, woke up the next morning and went, oh my God, I just saw so-and-so who died X number of years ago. And he said, but I must have dreamed it. And he walked downstairs and nobody in the house smoked and there was a cigarette in the ashtray. I mean, it's like something out of a Twilight Zone episode.
Wow.
You know, so, I mean, who knows about that? I think it's much more common for starters than we think it is.
Yes.
One of the techniques that I describe in my book has an interesting pedigree. EMDR, the eye movement therapy, was being practiced in the Chicago Veterans Administration Hospital. And a nice Baptist boy by the name of Dr. Alan Botkin from Baylor in our home state was doing EMDR, and in a 2-week period, 3 people said they made contact with people who crossed over, including people that they killed in battle as collateral damage. And the spirits of these people came to them in visionary experiences and said, I forgive you, you know, or it's okay, or I go on and I love you. The usual kinds of messages that we get. And it was transformative. For these people, it dramatically reduced their PTSD symptoms. So Dr. Botkin got curious about this and he discovered what he was doing differently. And out of that came an incredible therapy called Induced After-Death Communication, IADC, that's rooted in EMDR, the eye movement therapy that's done, that allows everyday people to apparently have contact with people who've crossed over. And when that happens, when I do that therapy, or when Dr. Botkin does that therapy, we're not acting as mediums. We don't transmit, or we're not channels. We catalyze a state in them that is a state of full waking consciousness. It's not a trance state. They've looked at the EEGs at the University of Virginia. And in this state of consciousness, they have the experience of making contact with the other side. Sometimes in very subtle fashions, sometimes in very pronounced ones, that people have said things like, my father just came and he kissed me in the cheek, or I'm dancing with my wife who passed 10 years ago, or I can smell the cologne of my grandmother who died 30 years ago, and she's talking to me. And these experiences for the individual are very real. And in fact, in Dr. Botkin's original study of something like 84 veterans, over 94% of them believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had actually made spirit contact. Is that proof that that's what's happening? No. It does suggest that these experiences are visceral and very convincing and self-validating.
Wonderful. And I'm going to circle back around to the idea of meditation and how you say that there's a consciousness that's on demand for people, like that of a Tibetan monk. If you don't have to meditate for years and years and years, there's a lot of people out there who are frustrated with meditation. Just as I'm not frustrated with meditation, but I got frustrated with breathwork.
Breathing thing that makes you nuts, right?
That, and yeah, well, I won't get into all the things that annoy me, but we'll stick with the question at hand. The question at hand is, for those people who don't enjoy meditation, what can you offer them, and what can you give them hope about changing that brain state and shifting it quickly?
There's a chapter in the book about a technology called binaural beat frequencies. It's probably a lot of your folks watching have heard of it. It's popularly marketed under the brand name Hemisync, which stands for Hemispheric synchronization. It was developed by a guy named Robert Monroe, who spontaneously had out-of-body experiences in the 50s and thought he was going crazy. And he met with a psychiatrist who said, this sounds a whole lot like out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, which nobody was talking about in those days. He developed this technology. The technology actually exists, but he sort of industrialized it or made it popular and marketed it. And it uses subaudible tones that are sent slightly detuned to one ear and to the other ear through headphones. And I won't get into all the specifics, the details of it, but they help the brain to catalyze deeper states of consciousness. So if we know what an EEG looks like, the electrical pattern in the brain of a Tibetan monk who's been meditating for 20 years, and we want to catalyze that in the viewers that are watching today, we can put you on a pair of headphones that have a lot of theta, that are tuned to catalyze a theta state, and then we'll gradually shoehorn you down into a state of consciousness very similar to the state of a Tibetan monk that's been meditating for 20 years on your first listening. Okay. Now, the more you use them, the better you get, and the easier it becomes to catalyze those states. But this is an accelerated way of getting there a lot faster. And so we can sort of catalyze different brainwave states. The newest and best are what's called gamma meditations or hyper gamma that use a lot of slow theta waves, real slow. That's that state just above sleep where your body's deeply, deeply relaxed, but a little high tickle of really fast waves, which are gamma or hyper gamma, and that sort of keeps you alert. So like a really good meditation where your body's like, you know, you're like liquid, you were poured into the chair in which you're in, you know, but your mind is like razor sharp. And so you can use gamma or hyper gamma, binaural beat frequency audios, many of which are available for free on YouTube. You can start to experiment with them there. There are applications. I'm not very good with those. I'm a boomer. But there are applications that you can get online to help catalyze those states. And of course, you can go to Hemisync, HEMI-SYNC. Go to hemisync.com, I believe it is, and purchase those as an audio download or a CD if you like.
Well, of course, I was liking the hyper gamma. I mean, if there's a choice between gamma or hyper gamma,
go for the good stuff.
Yeah, then I'm going to go for that.
What did you think of them? It's like, I just felt like I was deeply grounded, and then there was this energy moving up my spine and up over the crown of my head, like Kundalini energy, like sitting way up high when I listened to those. And in fact, I did an hour-long meditation and a couple of weeks ago, and then spontaneously I had these profound past life memories that just came suddenly and unbidden. It was a little intense,
Wow.
but they just kind of came on the heels of it. So you may notice, and we may have talked about that I, was that a squirrel? I have some attention deficit disorder, Trisha, and one of the best things as a therapist is that in using these Hemisync and binaural beat frequency audios, that I could slow down and really focus and sit with my clients in a way that I hadn't been able to before. It allowed me to slow my mind down and really try and be single pointed and make my clients the focus of my attention. Almost like they're the source of my meditation. And when I'm there, or more accurately, when Gregg's not there, but my higher self is there, then I'm a really effective therapist and God makes me look good.
Well, I hear what you're saying. And I think that even for people who don't have ADD, we live in a time where we're trying to multitask with so many different applications, and we're all a little scattered. I mean, you know, to some degree. So I think it's vital. I mean, I keep preaching meditation, but it doesn't work for everyone. So it's wonderful to put some other ideas out there. People can't slow down enough.
A little bit faster and a little easier. And,
Yeah.
you know, the last thing I would say about meditation is we need to remember it's a meditative practice, not a meditative perfection. There's not a person on the planet that sat down to play a piano concerto and on their first try said, well, I can't do this. This is ridiculous. But people all the time say, well, I tried it once and I can't meditate. It's like saying I tried playing tennis once and I didn't play like a tennis pro, so there's something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong. It is a practice. And I encourage people to start really, really small, like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, you know. And you know, why not use the tools that the pros use? For those people that are heard of the so-called psychic spies, you know, remote viewers, the military remote viewers that went into a trance state, and this is well documented. I didn't read it in National Enquirer. These are well documented. For 20 years, the government pumped millions of dollars into what amounts to psychic spies who would do remote viewing. They would channel information from a distance about the enemy and basically spy on the enemy at a distance. And they did some basic training, and one of the first places they went was to the Monroe Institute, where they worked with binaural beat frequency technology to practice catalyzing those deep states of consciousness where they could access intuitive information. So if it's good enough for the government and their psychic spies, I figure we'll probably benefit from it too.
Very interesting. And then the last thing that I want to ask you, and this is really just about healing in general, since you are the seagull healer, then had to circle back to that.
Yeah, the bad news is they keep pooping in my hands, so it's nasty.
But there's a lot of trauma that I've observed as a teacher in society, and there's a lot of people who don't have the resources. I've worked with mainly, populations that don't have money when I've worked as a teacher, low income districts, and there's all kind of trauma that runs through young people's lives. And I get questions from parents who have kids who are addicted to drugs, kids who've tried to commit suicide, kids who are really traumatized, both their own kids and foster kids and all types of youth. And my heart goes out to young people, and for parents who do have the resources and time and money to invest in this beyond just traditional therapy. Traditional therapy is important, especially if that teenager can openly talk with someone. But do you think that this could be very helpful for young people? I would imagine, if I was guessing, that it can, because they can shift pretty quickly. They don't have as much baggage.
Well, I want to be careful and not oversell. There's research that things like yoga and meditation and mindfulness practice are very useful in treating trauma, and that people improve. Craniosacral therapy is another approach where there's some research, but it's pretty intensive. I think I would like to be able to say there's ways that I know of for people without resources that cannot do therapies like EMDR and brain spotting to heal from severe trauma. I don't know of them. I know mindfulness practice and binaural beat frequencies and yoga and Tai Chi can all be really helpful. And they probably make a dent in things and make life better for those people. Can that heal post-traumatic stress disorder? Probably not. What I would say is, and this is the good news, and a lot of people may not know this. Again, it sounds too good to be true. There's at least one study that demonstrates that people with full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder can do 12 sessions, extended sessions of EMDR, the eye movement therapy or rapid eye release that you talk about. They did 12 sessions, and at the end of those 12 sessions, 77.7%, so roughly 4 out of 5, no longer met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. That, I think, for most people on the street is mind-blowing. And even still for a lot of therapists, it's like, no, you don't heal PTSD that quick. But yeah, you can. Does it always happen that quickly for my clients? No. Does it happen a lot faster than it would just kind of shoot in the breeze in more traditional talk therapies? Yes, it can and does happen a lot faster. People with post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if it's in what we call encapsulated trauma, Tricia, which is like one car wreck or one rape or one incident of sexual abuse. Not that those aren't horrible experiences, but if they're not complex, if there's not 5 million of them, then we just come in and we do EMDR, maybe 3 or 4 sessions around that one incident, and they're done. And that incident goes in a long-term memory, and they can watch a movie about rape or a car wreck, and they're like, oh yeah, I had one of those. But it's like talking about yesterday's lunch, like I ate a burger yesterday. It's in long-term memory. It no longer triggers the amygdala and they freak out anymore. Have a flashback, if you will. So what I would say, what is promising is the newer techniques that we have, like brain spotting and EMDR, are much faster. Can people do this outside of therapy? Probably not, okay? But again, Tai Chi, mindfulness, meditation, all really helpful ways to mitigate the effects and may nick away long-term at the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder.
One of my dreams, and I hope that my next book covers this because I'm targeting the population of colleges and college students, is to hire people like you to work in those areas with students. And, maybe this could be, at the beginning of schools, or, maybe it wouldn't be the whole time, but to really address the trauma that runs through certain populations and have that tool available and explain to them, and then have a district pay for it, or a particular college pay for it. And I know that more and more colleges are looking into that idea of healing. You also mentioned in a video that brain spotting helped people after a horrific trauma, Sandy Hook. I believe that was the one that you mentioned. So
Yeah,
I would like to.
yes, fairly new, but it was the #1 rated intervention for adults after Sandy Hook, rated as twice as effective as second place for adults after Sandy Hook. So we need a lot more research on brain spotting. The root modality with it uses the fixed eye positions. But there are thousands of practitioners around the world, and boy, there's a reason why we're taken to it. All I can talk about is not research, but my personal experience. It's literally transformed the lives of, dozens and dozens of my clients.
Yeah, and that idea though of after a traumatic event, there are other countries that, after that horrible event that happened in, I believe it was Norway, where 50 kids were killed at a summer camp, they took care of Norway, and their idea was peace and love for one another, and we're going to take care of one another as community. And that's what we need more of after these moments in America where we see violence. We need to descend on these places with people who know energy work, with people who know trauma release, and can help people transform in those moments. Because I believe, it's just my belief when I look at the energy grid work, if you don't do that, then violence spreads.
Yeah, the EMDRIA, which is the EMDR International Association, actually has trauma teams that go in. They went in after Oklahoma City, and they went in after 9/11 and brought EMDR therapy to people that wanted it and work with them. And so it's nice to know, and hats off to those folks, both the organization and all the individual therapists who volunteered their time freely.
Wow.
Weren't paid. And I think they even went on their own money in terms of travel to these places to be of service. And it's exciting because this modality can make a big difference in a relative hurry.
Yeah.
And not years and years of therapy. So we can come in and do a couple of months or even a few weeks to kind of stabilize things. And people are in a lot better footing than if they didn't. I mean, I literally went through some life changes here in the last few months, and I did 2 3-hour sessions, and it was like, okay, the worst of that's done,
And I keep coming back to near-death experiencers because I think they can benefit from this, but they could benefit from just the trauma of their death, because most of us have some sort of PTSD. And back when mine occurred, I didn't know that I had PTSD. I only knew that year when I was still in the body cast, I couldn't watch any show about hospitals. So ER was really popular at that time. And just the stretcher going through that room, because I was being wheeled in finally.
The fight or flight response, and
I was out of my body, yeah. And I thought, this is weird. It doesn't take much, and I didn't realize that freak out moment was PTSD. I just didn't know that. I just thought, okay, I've got to calm down, work through this. So it took many years to even know that I had PTSD. So I'm glad that others talk more openly about it. But even if you think you don't have trauma around a moment, it can show up later. So that's why I always encourage people to go ahead and do it before it shows up.
There you go.
Yeah. But have you found that you work with some near-death experiencers around their death, or do you think that would, certainly you want to get to the spiritual part of it, but if it's a new experience, it might be helpful around the dying process?
Yeah, sometimes before we can do a spiritual activation, we'll need to kind of stabilize whatever trauma is around the death itself. And even there's a certain level of trauma and you can back me up on this one. How do you come back into a world that is, let's face it, often so tortured and violent and unfair after being in a space of perfect love? And so that's trauma in and of itself. I'm not exaggerating. It's like, how can I even begin to live in this world having seen and been there? And that's painful and hard. And I think a lot of near-death experiences are wildly sensitive to that, and I don't fault them for that. And having said that, while you're on the planet, you need to live in the world, be in the world, but not of the world. So how do we both hang on to that experience and the power of it, and then live out of that in the world. And I think sometimes brain spotting and EMDR can be really helpful in relieving the trauma out of that, and giving the mind a different way to think about it. So instead of the panic of, oh my gosh, I got to live in my body, it's like, okay, now that I've seen the light of heaven and I am in a body, what's my mission and what can I do with that? How can it be useful?
I think so many of us love to go back to the love of God and the beautiful parts of that, not the coming back and seeing this world. And I did have another moment of realization during our session, and that was, I looked at the lights along the river that I had to come back to and remind people to turn on the lights. But this time I saw how much darkness there was around them. And I didn't actually see that before. I just thought, okay, got to tell people to turn on their lights, and, I'll go live down there and, and deal with this. And it wasn't as traumatic I mean, I didn't want to leave God's presence, certainly. And I was upset about that. But this time I kind of clearly saw how deeply needed these lights were. And that was a little jarring, that this is important work to remind people to connect to their spirit and to begin to heal and to do this light work, that it's very much needed.
Yeah, I like to believe that we all have our part to play and a role to play in the unfolding. And honestly, I think when we're doing that, there's nothing that's quite as joyful and as fulfilling as doing that. Really, I mean, I'm all for vacation and, a beer on the beach and all that business. But what floats my boat is waking people up and being a part of that and seeing their lives change and transform, and they light up and then they pass the light to others. I mean, it's what we're on the planet for. So let's be about our business. Yes,
yes. And be of this world, or be not of this world, but in this world is a good metaphor. And I keep saying one more question, but this is truly the last one. But when you say that as a therapist, I think there's a lot of people who get so lost in the idea of, oh, love is all that matters. No, just love each other, forgive everything. But there are some real world things that you sometimes have to deal with as a therapist and as an instructor in a classroom. Sometimes you have to call authority. Sometimes you have to set boundaries. Sometimes there are real things that must occur, and you're not protecting people if you don't. And so that balance, could you say something about that balance?
Yeah, well, I mean, a scriptural metaphor comes to mind, or example comes to mind. You have Jesus, and he's getting oil put on his head, and he's getting, he's getting this nice massage, and one of the disciples says, hey, we could sell that oil. We could get money for that. We could give it to the poor, almost like guilting Jesus or shaming him. And Jesus goes, the poor will always be with us, and a little lower on the left, honey. That's good. Oh, that's a spot. I mean, we all need to take care of ourselves. We all need to have healthy boundaries. And we need to remember that love is not just about loving other people, but loving ourselves. And I don't think for a minute that God is asking us to allow ourselves to be abused in his name. That's just not my model. Be of service, absolutely, but not to take abuse or stand for that. And what does that teach the abuser too? That it's okay, that you don't mind it, that you'll sign up for more, like keep hitting me, I don't mind, everything's great.
Oh yeah, and then let's give you a position of power too.
Yes. So I do, love includes love of self and honoring of self. If we are all children of God, that includes Tricia and Greg. And there needs to be time for self-care and healthy boundaries. And also that boundary setting also helps to teach the person that's being abusive or out of line about what they can do and what they can't do. And ultimately, and please hear this the right way, a gift to them if it's done in as much as possible from the highest parts of ourselves.
Yes, that's a great place to end. So thank you. And I do want to remind people the title of your book is The Quickening, Leaping Ahead on Your Spiritual Journey. So you can just leap away. And please check the links below for Gregg's workshops and for the Near-Death Experience Summit that's coming up. I'll update that. I don't have the page up yet, but you can follow me and University of Heaven. And I can't wait to share it with you. But thank you, Gregg, for talking with me. It's been a ton of fun.
A pleasure to be with you.